Hello, my name is Nicholas Detweiler. I'd like to talk to you today about John Brown and the ghosts of Pottawatomie Creek. There's two things I'd like you to know about John Brown. He was a terrorist, became a martyr, and he's my hero because he did so. Supplementary, he was a redeemer of the soul of our nation from our sin of slavery, United States' own God-given son. Having grown up in this country, I find it difficult not to judge along the standards of Christianity. Along those lines, despite his terrorism, he's most worthy. So let's hear the story of John Brown, his descent into terrorism, his rise into martyrdom. The immortality of truth came from his death. Brown's descent into terrorism was a result of bleeding Kansas, which in turn was a result of the Kansas-Nebraska Act. This act reopens Kansas to slavery. Stephen Douglas and Andrew Butler passed the act in order to forestall the conflict among anti-slavery, pro-slavery politicians. What the act did set Kansas up for bloody turmoil. By allowing the question of slavery to be decided by popular vote within the territory, Douglas and Butler paved the way for politically motivated settlers to settle in Kansas and be ready to fight. John Brown's sons were among them. Now, the first territorial elections in Kansas saw massive fraud. Most of it likely came from Missouri. It's well documented that Missouri settlers who were in favor of slavery in Kansas saw opportunity in the upcoming elections and much incentive to see Kansas become a slave state. They miscalculated the nation's distaste for election fraud, and their legacy was one of pain and strife for Kansas. Notable example of this be Sheriff Samuel Jones. Election day, Jones led a raid to steal the ballot box of Jackson County, was in turn appointing sheriff of the same county. On the other side of Jones, you had men like Amos Lawrence, established the city of Lawrence to be a bastion for anti-slavery settlers in Kansas. Now, in 1855, outside of Lawrence, an argument that erupted between Franklin Coleman and Charles Dow, after Dow caught Coleman trying to steal lumber from him. This argument ended. Cole shot Dow in the back, shotgun, dead on the spot. Coleman escaped Lawrence for Lecompton, pleaded his case to Sheriff Jones as a like-minded settler, see Kansas be a slave state. Jones's investigation led him to arrest Dow's friend Jacob Branson. Of course, had nothing to do with the murder. Now, as Branson was being transported to Lecompton, he was rescued by residents of Lawrence. Jones's answer to this was to mass a small army of Missouri border ruffians, loaded up on liquor to assault Lawrence. At this point, the violence that had erupted convinced John Brown to come to Kansas. He made it his mission to defend the residents of Lawrence from men like Sheriff Jones. This conflict can be referenced as the Wakarusa War, though it only saw a single casualty. It came to a conclusion when the territorial governor Robinson worked out a deal with the residents of Lawrence, like the future Governor Shannon, and that was likely a relief to many, but it was not for John Brown. He felt that Jones was not the man to go home empty-handed. He was right. Less than 6 months later, Jones returned to serve his warrants and was again rebuffed. On his exit from town, he was shot in the leg, but survived. Incident provoked an even larger support group to amass behind him and return to the town. This time, critical defenders like John Brown, his sons, were not at Lawrence. The following day, Charles Sumner was almost beaten to death in the Senate. Sumner was one of a few abolitionist senators given a speech entitled Crimes Against Kansas, where he called out men like Stephen Douglas, Andrew Butler, specifically for the trouble that they brought to Kansas. Now, Butler's relative, Preston Brooks, almost beat Sumner to death, metal-handled cane, after he was advised by a friend that dueling was only for gentlemen. Sumner was no gentleman, in their estimation. Now, these dual tragedies were more than John Brown could handle. Son John Brown Jr. oversaw him as he was captain of the Pottawatomie Rifles, who had organized as Minutemen militia specifically to protect free state settlers. John Brown Jr. ordered his father to do what he did next. I would say he would not be able to argue that this was terrorism. You could argue at that point that Brown was a state actor defending Kansas. But his son certainly gave no such order. He simply gave his father leave to do as he would, along with several of his brothers. But he advised them to do nothing rash. Now, let us not be blind to John Brown's failings for the Pottawatomie Creek Massacre of Shirley 1. Brown's response to the sacking of Lawrence, caning of Charles Sumner, was to travel with 7 other men, sons, son-in-law, a few others, to Pottawatomie Creek, murder 5 men. Drag them unarmed from their homes on the creek, cut them to pieces with broadswords, leaving them for their families to find them the next day. And this has never been heard of in the anti-slavery community. This sort of violence shocked the entire nation. And that violence was beyond most in the anti-slavery community. Now, this act did not bring peace to Kansas, despite supporters of Brown's insistence that it did. It was immediately followed by a raid on the settlements of Osawatomie and Brown Station. And Lawrence was a long way from seeing the true depths of inhumanity. Came with Quantrell's massacre of Lawrence. Saw 150 deaths of unarmed civilians. And many of those civilians had been disarmed by Jones when he sacked Lawrence. I want to emphasize terrorism is only good for terror. Brown became endeared to many in Kansas, no doubt, because he risked himself, his family. He made a choice, right or wrong, to do something rather than nothing. It's hard not to respect such a man who fights for you. But this is ultimately what leads to greater suffering. Had this proved to be the best of Brown, we never would have honored him as we do. Brown's violence polarized the anti-slavery community. Men like William Lloyd Garrison published the most read abolitionist newspaper, openly condemned Brown and his violence. But what Brown proved was that he could transcend. After Kansas, Brown made it his mission to lead an insurrection against the United States. He would take the armory there, escape into Appalachia, mass an army of freed slaves who would liberate the United States. Now, for a historian concerned with the freedom of slavery, it's difficult not to romanticize Brown's vision. There's something inherently romantic about it. But for those fighting on the front lines, romance is generally a fairy tale. Those people deal with reality. Many allied with Brown, his violence only made their life more difficult. It's a way of terrorism. Brown's enemies talked about the massacre, Pottawatomie Creek. And the man responsible for the most death at the massacre of Lawrence was not Quantrell. was Bloody Bill Anderson, who at a young age, after hearing about the Pottawatomie Massacre, they were his family's friends that had been killed, he was told by his father, Will Anderson, that Brown was right for doing what he did. Will Anderson told his son, Bill, "You must make the other man more afraid of what you will do to him than you are afraid of what he will do to you." It's a terrorist motto if I ever heard it. This is not the lesson that Brown took. Brown's venture into Virginia did not produce the results that Brown expected, at least not consciously anyways. For this reason, some call him crazy. Many are confounded by Brown's act. He had 22 men with which to free the United States, and that, by most accounts, at least seems a little crazy. Now, I suggest Brown might have known what he could accomplish, but I have little evidence to present on it. My only real evidence is that having studied Brown, he seems very sane. Others have said it. But also, if you look at the results of the acts, Brown's acts, the results produced his inner heart's desire. He was ready to drown the nation in blood if it meant that it would bring an end to slavery. Now, the critical moment was when Brown chose to become a martyr. He did this by asking his men not to fire on the soldiers attempting to kill them, just let themselves be killed. Given hindsight, we need not ask what his motivation was unless we are utterly convinced. Could not fathom the country being fascinated with his men's sacrifice. I don't believe that. If you look at Brown's whole life, I would say what stands out more than anything else is his overestimation of man. His trust, goodwill was his downfall in business. But ironically, when it came to war making, he found it very effective. And David Blight, who is a professor at Yale, has an open lecture on Brown called The Election of 1840 and the Secession Crisis. Find it on YouTube if you like. He has 4 fundamental questions revolving around Brown. The first question was, what is the meaning of martyrdom? I would distill this into what is martyrdom. The answer is when the conviction of principle weighs more on a man's soul than his own life does. This was certainly the case for Brown and his men at Harper's Ferry. It's easy to sacrifice someone else for one's desire, but it's hard to sacrifice one's own. This is precisely what Brown would do. This is why we sing John Brown's Body. It's a rendition, the Battle Hymn of the Republic. But it was rewritten to honor John Brown during the Civil War. We sing it to this day, even when we don't know who it's for. Now, Blight's second question was, how do we deal with revolutionary violence? I'm not sure if he meant, how should we handle revolutionary violence in general? Or how should we handle it if that violence is righteous? Now, for the latter, I would say, the question is not how do we deal with revolutionary violence. The question is, how does that violence deal with us? Generally, though, given that the violence is not righteous, I'd say the answer is, as we must. However, this answer does leave open the next question that he asks. When is it all right to violate human law for a higher law? This is how you would answer the question, is the violence righteous or not? If it is righteous, then it would seem like it adheres to a higher law. This is the only question I have a really tough time answering. When is it all right to violate human law for a higher law? My only answer is that it's only all right if you have no other choice. My only faith is that the accounting for this only works out. It's God and God alone doing the accounting. But again, my Christian faith slips through. Now, Blight introduced his last question with the statement, Brown was a white man, killed other white men to end slavery. And he followed that statement by suggesting many black students he had taught thought that Brown was black. To this day, he needs to convince people that Brown was white. Now, I'm not exactly sure what the question there is, but what I'm inferring is that the question is, does it matter that Brown was white? Now, if that's his question, I think Blight lost Brown's point, which is there's no such thing as a white person or a black person. We are all people, period. If we could stop believing the myth of racial social construction, then the answer is clearly that Brown was not a white person. He was just a person. Brown's sacrifice, his life, the life of those he loved, likely have been given 1,000 times over, knowing what it would bring. It is uncomely, historian, to speculate. Let me be the ugliest one among them, so I have no contentions speculating on this. Brown made sense, total sense, when you accept maybe he knew in the depths of his subconscious the nation could rise, driven to violence, in order to resolve this awful contradiction of American humanity, slavery. Now, this sounds like a justification for terrorism. Let me quickly dismiss you. I persuade it was an act of mercy, maybe genius, but it's certainly not an act of terrorism. Pottawatomie was an act of terrorism. Harper's Ferry was something more. Had the length of John Brown's measure been Pottawatomie, promise you would not know who he is. Only became more because of his legacy and the legacy of John Brown's body. I became enamored with a reggae band named John Brown's Body. Because of this, I decided to see who is this man that we sing for, having never been taught a thing about John Brown. Today, the most fascinating thing about Brown to me is that despite the enduring tributes, we have virtually no knowledge of who he is. After September 11th, there were some comparisons made because of the terrorism. But time and circumstance make those comparisons mostly irrelevant. What I would like you to know is that terrorists ultimately aren't special people. The capacity of the human to cause pain and suffering to their fellow humans might be the least special thing about us. Brown became special because he was a terrorist who transcended terrorism. When we see men who are better than terrorists, men like William Lloyd Garrison, could see Brown as a terrorist, then they saw him become more. They loved him for that. We can too. That's why we sing. Blight and some other historians, I feel, have made the mistake of not concentrating on Brown at his darkest moment. You see the mistake he made at Pottawatomie Creek. You see that Harper's Ferry was his redemption. And then see how he failed Kansas. Might have seen how he could rise to serve the nation. He certainly did so. I want to close with a quote from Frederick Douglass. It's one of Brown's closest friends and confidants. Douglass had been invited to participate at Harper's Ferry, sacrifice that need not have been made. Douglass knew his weapons were words. After Brown's death, he gave a deeply, deeply stirring tribute to Brown, more than one, in fact. But what stood out more than anything for me is when he said his passion, his zeal for my race far exceeded my own. It was as a taper light as to the burning of the sun. I could live for the slave. I could speak for the slave. John Brown could die for the slave. Thank you for your time today. I hope you enjoyed this. Have a good one.